So you want to know how to pass the AP exams, 3 essays, and today what I'm going to do is kind of go over the rubrics for the first 2 essays that we're attempting to kind of get an idea of what the requirements are. So this video is specifically looking at the rhetorical analysis. Argument will be another one, and then when we actually get to the synthesis essay, that one I will make another video for. But for the purpose of today, we're going to consider what is it that the AP exam looks for, and what does it take to get those 6 points that they kind of make this rubric off of. I'm going to go over both the rubric itself, but also a student sample that I thought was highly successful from the recent take-home. And, you're not going to get the chance to write like this on the AP exam, but just kind of the goods that exist within that student's essay, so you can kind of imitate or just consider what to do when you're writing your own essay in class, 40 minutes and all that. So let's kind of consider the categories before I go into specifics. So rhetorical analysis, what we're looking at is number 1, we're looking at thesis, right? Do you have a claim? Do you have something that can be argued throughout the entire piece? Is it clear? We're going to start with that. And then later we're going to look at the second part, evidence and commentary. So not only have you used sources, you also use sources that, relate with each other, talk about the whole, multiple in a paragraph. Do you actually have a complex mastery and understanding of the source itself so that you can actually work an argument through the different types of pieces that you pull from it. And lastly, perhaps the hardest to explain and also to, get the point for, the sophistication point. This one here really is just kind of having a complex understanding regarding the prompt. So it's not the surface level. It's more of, what is perhaps past that surface level, deeper into the implied purposes, what you can infer, and so forth. So let's go back to the very top, and I'll jump around with 2 tabs here. One, the student sample, and both the rubric here. So first point, we're looking at thesis. I'm not really going to look at the left side because the left side is kind of like things that you don't want to do, but let's look at the goods and also the additional notes on the bottom. So when it comes to the thesis, we got to consider if you respond to the prompt with a defensible thesis that analyzes the writer's rhetorical choices. And that's the biggest thing, right? It goes all the way back to that video we watched with Crazy 8 from Breaking Bad, where, is there a understanding of what the speaker wants to do, and also what are the choices they do in trying to get what they want. So in this case here, it is rhetorical analysis, meaning we're just looking at what is done well and also purposefully what is done to persuade an audience. At the same time, this is how they kind of decide the point. Responses that earn this point. The thesis responds to the prompt rather than restating or rephrasing the prompt, and clearly articulates a defensible thesis about the rhetorical choices the writer makes. So in this case, this is kind of like a build up from your intro. So if your intro is kind of confusing or it doesn't really exist, this point also suffers because your thesis comes out of nowhere. So in this case, you gotta, 1, respond to the prompt. They usually will ask you something very specific in terms of, is it towards a particular audience, in terms of like a son from Abigail Adams' letter, or to a massive audience like MLK's I Have a Dream speech, or in this case to a women's national convention, which Claire Booth does. So in this case, you also want to make sure that you don't restate or rephrase the prompt, meaning you don't just tell me that she's giving this particular speech, right? You have to give a little bit more in terms of what's happening, why she's giving this speech, and kind of infer a meaning from the reading itself. And at the same time, clearly articulates a defensible thesis about the rhetorical choices. So you don't have to mention the actual rhetorical choices the author makes in your thesis, but they want to know in general what kind of choices the author makes as a whole, right? So looking at the student samples, what I've done here is this whole thing is the thesis, but the blue is kind of the promises they make in the thesis, and also the whole thing in yellow was originally the thesis. So to be read. In a world where fake news thrives and basic editorial standards are often jettisoned as unnecessary, American journalist and politician Claire Booth Luce, at her speech to the Women's Press Club in 1960, calls out upon the American press for prioritizing sensationalist news over integrity and reporting the truth. So in this case, it's not just a restatement of the prompt they've given you. We know that it's this speaker, Claire Booth Luce. We know she's a politician and journalist. We know that she's talking to the Women's Press Club in 1960, but we don't know why she's doing it. So this author gives 2 points. 1, It's a world where fake news thrives and basic editorial standards are often jettisoned as unnecessary. Yes, that's why this is given in the first place, and at the same time, why she's doing it or how she's doing it. She calls out upon the American press for prioritizing sensationalist stories over integrity and reporting the truth. So the two go hand in hand. There's a why, and then there's a how, or like at least a what she's doing in this case here. So in this case, successful thesis, and they promised me a few things that will be touched upon in this essay. They will talk about how it's a world of fake news and how there's basic editorial standards that are jettisoned, and at the same time, she's going to talk about how the American press is being called out, and at the same time, it's how Claire Booth Lewis will talk about why sensational news are being prioritized, integrity of the press not really being there, and why it's important to have that integrity. So this is a pretty clear thesis and also a very complex thesis. And if you get the chance to read the whole essay, it is a pretty good premise as well in context. It's pretty complex. So sophistication will be earned there, but I'll talk more about that later on. So going back to the rubric here, additional notes. The thesis may appear anywhere within the essay. So in this case, I mean, usually it's the last sentence of your intro paragraph, but it does not have to be. So a little bit of food for thought. If you look at this essay as well from the student, there's still a little bit more afterwards past their thesis. Originally, this was underlined because they wanted to let us to know what this thesis was, but that isn't the last line. So in this case here, as long as you can kind of follow along and know what you're defending somewhere in your essay, then it would work. But to play it very safe and just be clear for your reader, last sentence is usually a nice place to put it. At the same time, a thesis that meets the criteria can be awarded the point whether or not the rest of the response successfully supports that line of reasoning. Meaning, if the rest of your essay doesn't really talk about the things you promised, but it's a good thesis regardless, you would still earn the point. So at the very bare minimum, you can earn at least 2 out of 6 for the AP exams essay if you have a good thesis. The reason why you would earn 2, not 1 out of 6, is because evidence is 1 out of 4. You cannot score a 0 in that category because they assume that some sort of evidence is given. So, speaking of evidence, here's the next part. Scrolling down, we have evidence and commentary. This one's a little bit hard to explain and do, but here's the process. So, let's talk about 4 points, because 4 points, it just kind of gets worse and worse from there on. So this is kind of the ideal of what we're looking for, right? There's 2 parts to this, because it's 2 parts when it comes to what scores the points, but at the same time, what they're looking for in terms of giving you that point. So they're going to ask you to make textual references, direct quotes, or paraphrases that are relevant to the thesis. So whatever you promised there in your thesis, your evidences have to relate back to it. And you have to provide well-developed commentary, and that consistently and explicitly explain the relationship between the evidence and the thesis. So in this case here, it has to not only be relevant evidence that you've brought in, but you have to explain why it's relevant, and also rhetorically what she's doing and all that. So in this case, it's a bobbing and weaving in terms of bringing the information in, explaining it back to the thesis, but also in the body paragraph explaining it for itself. At the same time, this is what they're grading you on. They are going to grade you based on the fact that you provided commentary that engages the details of the text to draw conclusions about rhetorical choices, meaning you can't just drop a big-ass quote and be like, here's what I mean, and hopefully you can infer why I brought this quote in. No, you have to explain piece by piece, line by line, the choices you made, because the choices you made, assumingly, are not random. So in this case, you got to make sure that your explanation is clear. At the same time, integrate evidence from the text throughout to support the student's analysis. So in this case here, you got to make sure that you use evidence to justify every paragraph. So it's not just like one really good paragraph that you've done so, it has to be throughout the entire piece. So every paragraph has to have a nice peppering of evidences throughout. Now, keep this in mind. Your writing, it has to be clear as possible, because writing that suffers from grammatical and or mechanical errors that interfere with communication cannot earn the 4th point in this row. So if you have choppy language, or your writing is not clear, or that your grammar is shaky here and there, then you would only earn 3 out of 4 regardless of how bright your analysis is. So speaking of good analysis, let's go ahead and look at this paragraph here. I'm looking at this paragraph because this student does a good job using multiple sources, using multiple evidence explanation. So in this case, they're not just kind of giving us one quote, one explanation, next paragraph. This is kind of a combination of evidences. So we're looking at this paragraph. I do want to start from the top. I guess we'll give it more clarity here. So they write, What binds us as a people and as a nation is a combined experience, a common picture of today's events. Wow, that's not even a traditional topic sentence where it's kind of like, I'm going to tell you what this paragraph is about. It gives us like a broader idea of the topics in this paragraph here in terms of what journalism is and so forth. The source of those experiences is largely based on what is reported by journalists. The accurate depiction of events and the credibility of the sources are relied upon by our nation to gain knowledge, formulate opinions, and make sound judgments. Luce, in her introduction, makes it clear to the journalists that although they are amazing, they have many gaping flaws that she will not, quote, fawn on it, butter it up, exaggerate its virtues, and play down its faults. So, wow, not only does the student give their own sort of interpretation of what journalism is, they finish their own sentence with the actual speech's evidence as well. But rather, attempt to expose of these follies. She repeats, quote, you asked me to tell you what's wrong with you, which hammers in the fact that she will not be open to anger or offense at her words because she was invited to share insight on the journalist's current status, whether it be good or bad. In that way, she also plays into the journalist's guilt when she mentions the U.S. daily press today is not inspiringly good, it is far and away the best press in the world, in order to imply that although journalists buy into the belief that the American press is, quote, superior to others, she says that they do not go to enough lengths to reveal the truth. So watch this. And it kind of goes on the same in this whole paragraph here. Not only is the student using multiple evidences to back themselves up, not even to just throw in there, but to also combine with their own explanations. This is a very masterful bobbing and weaving of evidences from the source itself and also their insights. So they're not only just explaining their views, they're bringing in evidence, they're tying it with their own views, they're tying it to another evidence, and they're going on through the entire speech itself. And not only with that, they also bring in, boom, rhetorical devices, which they also explain. So to earn a 4 in this category, you kind of have to do the same thing, right? You got to make sure that you have a clear topic sentence, that you have explanation that is from your own insight, evidence throughout, not just big quote drops, but also just pieces here and there to align with your own views. And at the same time, evidence rhetorical analysis. If you have all that, you've succeeded a 4 in that case. Now, the last category is perhaps the most complicated because there's multiple ways you could earn this point. And also, it's kind of like, well, what do you mean by sophistication? So, just to read the text itself, demonstrate sophistication of thought and or a complex understanding of the rhetorical situation. So that sense is more about you showing you comprehend, right as if you know what you're talking about. Because a lot of people will just throw in a quote, explain the quote. It's kind of like, okay, cool, you understand the quote, but it feels like you don't understand the prompt itself or the reading itself. So here's a couple of ways you can earn this point, and it goes down in a list of 6 items here. Responses that earn this point may demonstrate sophistication or thought and or a complex understanding of the rhetorical situation by doing any of the following. 1. Crafting a thesis that demands nuanced consideration of textual evidence to prove and then successfully proves it. So in this case here, even though it says crafting a thesis, it also is based off your intro paragraph. So if your intro paragraph is very complex in terms of how you entered it, along with your thesis statement, boom, there's a point. Number 2. Explain the significance or relevance of the text's purpose within a broader context. So even though this is Claire Booth Luce's, speech to a particular group, it also talks about journalism as a whole, the U.S. press. If you're able to tie in this speech to a bigger subject, perhaps in a conclusion paragraph, boom, another point. Engage in concession, rebuttal, and or refutation of other arguments relating to the thesis. If you're able to kind of consider other sides or other views, or maybe how the press is feeling when they're hearing Claire Booth Luce talk, and just how they might respond to it in the body paragraphs themselves, boom, you're understanding concession, you're understanding rebuttal, another point for sophistication. Number 4, recognizing and accounting for contradictions or complexities within the text. This one's tricky. Remember, we talked about logical fallacies. Number 4, sophistication can be earned if you understand that there's a couple of fallacies existing or that they contradict themselves. I mean, for a purpose, not randomly, right? But you can kind of pick out those fallacies. Boom, another point. Making effective rhetorical choices that strengthen the force and impact of the student's argument. So in this case, not only are you understanding the author's rhetorical choices, but you even put in your own rhetorical devices, perhaps, to write your body paragraphs and so forth. So in this case, just good writing as a whole, transitions, and all that also included. And lastly, number 6, utilizing a prose style that is especially vivid, persuasive, convincing, or appropriate to the student's argument. This one's tricky because they basically mean voice in your writing. So in this case, if you feel like you have a nice verbosity to your writing, that you feel like you're very clear as a person, you feel like you're very good in terms of flow, transitions, just word choice as an author, your writing, if it's good, can earn you a point for sophistication. So any of these 6 really allows you to earn that point. So an additional note, and the last thing to talk about, this point should be awarded only if the demonstration of sophistication or complex understanding is part of the argument, not merely a phrase or reference. So in this here, it means that your one of the 6 examples ties in with the entire essay itself and is clear in terms of why you include that in the first place. It's incorporated, it's not forced, it is naturally in your argumentation there. So let's go ahead and look at this last bit here in terms of sophistication. I mentioned topic sentences from this author are not conventional. They have a nice complexity to the way they write. So this is their, I believe, last body paragraph, and their topic sentence is, disinformation posing as news is nothing new in the world. Even as early as the 20th century, yellow journalism, or the late 18th century when political parties used newspapers as political tools, all of which present little or no legitimate, well-researched news, while instead using eye-catching headlines for increased sales. So even though it kind of is a fragment when it comes to the second part here, because it should be kind of a, what do you call it? It should be an add-on to this sentence here. You can tell that this author is both using their own historical knowledge and also relevant information to add on to their topic sentences here. That's complex. That doesn't exist in the reading itself. That is something that they use to add to sophistication here. And if your topic sentences are always like that for the most part, there's a point there. So that, in short, is going to be how you score for the rhetorical analysis paper. It seems like a lot, but really it's just 6 points where if you do all 3 categories really well, boom, there's your 6 out of 6. So just truth be told, a 4 out of 6 for the most part is a passing with a 3 at least for the AP exam. But really, this rubric is a lot easier than the previous 1 through 9. So I argue that you can score a 4 quite easily if you refine your rhetorical analysis paper a little bit more.